Well, folks, I hate to say it, but the Turks are at it again. They have apparently attacked some Russians in northern Syria. You know, the very same Russians that they worked out a ceasefire agreement with to conduct joint patrols to make sure that there was no violence going on in northern Syria, to create this 30-kilometer safe zone that the Syrian Arab Army, Russian military police, and the Turkish army were supposed to patrol together. In other words, the Turks, shot their partners in the back. They've betrayed the people who, perhaps, only in writing, but still officially were their allies. And this is not the first time. Just a couple days ago, I discussed how the Turks had apparently ambushed some of the Syrian Arab Army troops, that is meaning Assad's forces, in this northern Syria safe zone. It was both Turks and Free Syrian Army guys, jihadis. And I think back then I was saying, well, this will probably be swept under the rug, and we'll say that it was a mistake, and because they don't want this ceasefire to fall apart. Nobody has any interest in the ceasefire falling apart. At least that's what I thought. I mean, you would think that not even the Turks would want the ceasefire to fall apart yet. But it looks. I don't know how to look at this in any other way than saying that I was wrong. That the Turks, in fact, do want this ceasefire to end. It looks to me, like, hey, lightning doesn't strike the same place twice. And it seems very suspicious that the Turks would, attack both the Russians and the Syrians independently, within a couple days of each other, and for both of those to be accidents. Now, neither of these attacks were catastrophic. They weren't major battles. They were just sort of, firing at them. They wounded some men and then pulled back in both cases. There were no deaths that we know of in the case of the attack on the Syrian Arab Army or in the attack on the Russian MPs. What this looks like to me is more like a well thought out act by the Turks to assert their dominance. They're trying to growl in the face of the Russians and the Syrians, and to say, no, this is our property. This is Turkey now, and you folks need to back away. And that sentiment seems to be consistent with what some of the reports that we're getting out of this, saying that the Turks fired these artillery shells, or at least one, at the Russians because they were apparently mad that the Russians didn't tell the Turks ahead of time that they were going to be patrolling through that sector. And so the Turks essentially are operating on the premise of this is our territory, and the Russians and the Syrians are our guests in the safe zone. It's not that this is Syria and that we're here trying to even though it's a pretty weak premise, but their premise was originally that, hey, we're just coming into Syria to help protect this area, to make sure that nobody gets hurt, because we don't want that. We're peaceful, loving members of NATO. Obviously, that's not the case. It seems as though the Turks now view the Russians in the same way that they viewed the Americans, as the Americans were leaving. That, during the American ceasefire, the Americans weren't doing much to get the YPG/SDF out of this 30-kilometer safe zone. They saw them more as protecting them, as by having U.S. troops there. The Turks weren't going to kill the Americans, so the Kurds could essentially do whatever they wanted. They didn't have to worry about being rounded up, at least not as much. So the same apparently seems to be true from the Turks' perspective now that the Russians and Syrians are involved. Looks to them, from the Turkish perspective, like the Russians are, making the world safe for Kurds. And that they're not doing enough to try and, expel the YPG from this area, and so that the Turks can come and, import their Arabs from western Syria that have fled across the border into Turkey and resettle them here. The Turks, I guess, would prefer that we go back to having a hot war in this part of Syria, and that they just rip off the Band-Aid and expel the Kurds once and for all, whether the Russians and the Syrians are okay with it or not. But I think that Turkey's playing a very dangerous game, being a NATO ally, firing their weapons directly at the Russians. They could set off a world war quite possibly. Now, of course, just because folks in the West right now don't consider Turkey to be a Western nation in good standing, they are still members of NATO. And of course, NATO does have the clause about how you can't start an aggressive war and then invoke the NATO treaty. You have to be the one that's attacked. But of course, that's always subject to interpretation. Anyone can spin a war as a defensive war. The Turks can say that, if they end up getting into a war with Russia and Syria, they can say that, oh, we're just defending our borders, and the Russians are the aggressors here. And then they can, Erdogan could, in theory, invoke the NATO treaty and potentially bring two nuclear powers, the USA and the Russians, to a state of war. No, I don't want to sound like I'm fear-mongering. I don't think that will happen at this point. But, I think that not enough people are taking this situation seriously. It's a very big deal to have a NATO country exchanging fire with Russia. It wasn't too long ago that Turkey actually shot down a Russian fighter jet. And that was a very big deal at the time. People did take that seriously. So it looks like things are going to heat up again in Syria. I was hoping that maybe this safe zone ceasefire would, help the Turks demobilize in Syria and maybe, be able to say, oh, okay, the Russians and the Syrians have got this covered. We can withdraw now. And Erdogan could, take a bow and walk out and say, oh, and bring the troops home and claim victory and say, oh, we achieved our goal. Let's get out. But it looks like the Turks really want to push this. And that they do want to be involved in Syria in the long term. So I don't know where we go from here, but I have a feeling that the Russo-Turkish ceasefire is not going to produce a lasting peace. That there is still more fighting ahead that is going to erupt. And it may very well be the case now that the Kurds will become the Syrian and Russian proxies that are used to fight against the Free Syrian Army and the Turks. Because I think that the Russians recognize that it would not be a great idea for them to get into any direct battles with a NATO country. So I'll keep an eye on this, and obviously I'll address it if anything changes. So if you gain anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.